Hi, my name is Parth Chaudhary, and I'm here to share with you my learnings and to talk about my experience of securing an admit to the Kellogg Future Leaders Program, which is a deferred MBA program, and also interview invites from Columbia Business School as well as the Wharton School. And I was able to do this with a lot of help and support from Smith Berlicker and his team at Tilden. Although, just to be sure, this is not really a testimonial, and I'll come to that later. I do have some prepared notes with me, but the idea there is just to ensure that I'm not missing out on communicating all that I have to share. Just very briefly to start off with my background in terms of who I am and where I come from, because that's essentially an important part of your application as well. So I spent quite a few years in my early childhood living in Nigeria and Tanzania, and since then, say around middle school, I've been living in my hometown, which is Vadodara in Gujarat, India. Here, I studied at the Delhi Public School, and in my 11th, 12th, I was in the commerce stream. And unfortunately, during that, around the end of my 11th, I lost my dad, who was an extremely important pillar for me. So that was a very big setback. But thankfully, with the support of my friends and family, I directed my energies towards trying to make him proud. So I ultimately ended up with a 98.8% in my 12th boards, which brought me to the Sri Ram College of Commerce in New Delhi, where I pursued the BA Honors Economics program. And I think that was an absolutely fabulous experience. I was able to meet a lot of interesting people and engage with a lot of interesting ideas, which I'm quite sure I wouldn't have been able to if I were not to be at SRCC. And that was really a phase of continuous growth. What growth may be. So I had the opportunity to serve the Economic Society of our college as president. I was also chosen to represent India at the world's largest undergrad case competition, which is organized by HSBC, and ultimately we emerged as global champions there. I interned with Citibank and an edtech startup called Offiki, scored a 99.99 percentile in my CAT, as well as a 770 on the GMAT, with a 44 in verbal as well as 51 in quant. In terms of college outcomes, so to speak, I was placed in McKinsey and Company as well as the Boston Consulting Group, of which I chose the offer from McKinsey, and I'm looking forward to joining them just a few months from now. I'm currently also, with these placements in hand, leading an undergrad specific casebook to make the consulting placement experience better and smoother for my juniors and those students in colleges across the country, because of course undergrad casebooks is rare. With all of that context, why, right? That's the ultimate question. Why did I choose to apply for a deferred MBA? Let's just break it down. There are two parts to the word itself, a deferred and an MBA. And the idea behind applying for any deferred admissions is that it's not something you're joining immediately. Kellogg, for instance, is a program that you join after working or being engaged in meaningful employment for 2 to 5 years. So you have sufficient time for you to test yourself out in the industry, to really understand and pinpoint where your interests are and what you want to get out of your career, as well as your Kellogg MBA. But at this moment, securing a seat in a future Kellogg classroom is something which grants me a lot of safety to really do what I want to do. Now, I'm not shackled by the idea of meeting short term career goals, because I always know that I have a Kellogg MBA waiting for me. And even in case I don't want to continue with what I've done so far, an MBA is something that will really help me reach where I want to be. And on the other hand, there's an MBA, right, which is definitely a very enriching experience, especially from such a prestigious institution. And the idea behind applying abroad, for me at least, was that I always wanted to at least experience a global facing career. And I think that's something which will be greatly facilitated by an MBA abroad, especially at a school as prestigious as Kellogg, which I'm sure, as quite a few of you would have guessed, is where this background is from. But after having decided to apply, in just some time, I was able to understand I can't do it myself. There were multiple reasons for that. Okay, I think number one, of course, is that this was my very first time with profile-based admissions. I had never gone through such a process, so the entire idea was quite foreign to me. Secondly, even from SRCC, of course, it's an absolutely amazing place to be, but there was not a lot of history of deferred MBA admits, especially because it's a non-engineering college. And at the deferred state, not necessarily at the stage where you're applying for regular admission cycle after your work ex, but at least at this early decision stage, SRCC was not necessarily the best representative. And honestly, I think the third thing for me was just a mental mismatch of sorts coming from a tier two city. Probably even the idea of being at SRCC is something that was just so massive for me. I don't know even if I've probably really digested that yet after having completed my college. So the idea of applying to such prestigious institutions, जिनका probably कभी सपना भी नहीं देखा होगा, right? And the reason I say that is that you dream about things which are obviously tough to get, but they still seem within your reach. That's why you're dreaming. These are probably things that I probably never even dreamt of because that's how beyond me I felt they were. But then after deciding to do this and do this seriously, I understood that I would need external help. So that's when I decided to get in touch to identify a few alternatives. Then I spoke to them. Ultimately, I chose to work with Sumit Verlekar from Tilden. As I said, not a testimonial, but just to talk to you about my logic or philosophy in terms of how I chose the consultant that I want to work with. For me, at least, it was just about the intangible. I think in terms of getting someone who's really motivated, who has the right kind of energy for me, and who's really pushing you hard to achieve the maximum potential that you can have. Also, because they, with their experience, will know much better than you in terms of what your potential is in a deferred MBA admissions or applications context. So I think someone who really brought out that kind of motivation and drive is something that was extremely important for me. And that's what I felt Sumit would offer. And again, in retrospect, I think that's something that he met extremely, extremely well. Of course, there were a lot of tangibles as well in terms of the specific help and guidance. Naturally, I'll just come to that in a while. So after deciding that I want to apply, after identifying someone who's going to help me through the journey, then what were the steps involved? Okay. So the very first step was to really sit down and discuss and do a lot of retrospection and introspection. And that is something that this process in itself will really, really require you to. Why? Because in terms of the kind of ideas that you're communicating, you have to look at your past as well as maybe your present and see what are the common threads, and then look at your future and how everything lines up. So for you to do that, you have to think a lot. Okay, so what are the steps to be a bit more specific? So just to start, we sat down multiple times, got in multiple calls just to get to know each other better. He shared a template with me, and I tried to compile a detailed set of information in terms of everything that I've done so far. And using that, he created a specific action plan for me. And I think that was extremely helpful because I was able to understand what matters, what doesn't matter, and how to really prioritize things. And one thing that I did feel is that Tilden has a lot of data and experience to work with. And I think that's extremely helpful because that's something which forms the base for your choices in terms of what is more valuable as something to go on your application to be eliminated from your application. Because naturally at this stage, there'll be many things for you to talk about. Right after this initial stage, then we spend some time building the right narrative, trying to identify the specific goals that I want to achieve with my MBA as well as with my career, and also in terms of how my short-term plan will align with all of that. And then we really got down to the schools. We drew a specific timetable for ourselves, a set of deadlines, internal deadlines for us to meet, and then we took the schools head on one by one. Of course, every school has multiple essays, multiple questions, and of course, the starting ones will tend to take a bit longer because you're really still getting into the feel of how to work about this process. I think Sumit was extremely helpful in terms of sharing a lot of specific insights from a vast experience in the past. And that's something which really gave me a lot of direction at the very least, because you yourself know whatever you've done. I mean, everyone has made a CV. We've probably listed down all the highlights that we have, but how you put them together, how you link all of them, and how you ultimately ensure that the communication is going through in the most appropriate way. I think that sort of finesse is something that he was able to help me a lot with. And in fact, at this stage, I'll also mention that I really liked working with him because he wasn't spoon feeding me. Even in terms of essays, he always ensured that after, of course, giving me a lot of context about the school, its history, its program, and also about its application, I was always the one who had to write the first draft. It's not that he would share sample essays with me and I would probably just copy them and change words for my context and send them back to him. No, because when you're writing the first draft in your own words, ultimately, even in the final product that you have, which you'll make after rounds and rounds of editing and going back and forth, that will still retain the essence of who you are and how you communicate. And I feel that's extremely important because everyone has a very distinct style of communication as well as this reflective of their personality. And it's something you should definitely ensure is coming out from the application materials that you're ultimately submitting to the schools, right? So we also, in fact, created specific resumes for schools, maybe to make some small edits and make some changes to target them most appropriately. And after getting the invites, then we took on the next stage, which was preparing for the interview. And we got multiple calls as well as mocks to really practice the personal interview stage as well, and maybe in Wharton's case, the team-based discussion. And we decided what are the stories that we want to talk about, how we want to really try and strategize to ensure that we can get the best possible outcomes. A very good thing that I liked here personally is that once we began to work, we were completely on the same team, right? In the sense that there was no consideration of any sort in terms of a limited time being given to me or a specific limit on the iterations per essay or something like that. Once we had started working, we were completely on the same side. And so we were in it to do whatever it takes to ensure that we are ultimately getting that admin and getting what I deserve, or at least what hopefully I deserve. So, and that's something which is also empowering in its own way. Ultimately, it's also very important for you to understand that you need to be objective in terms of deciding whether you are actually in the right place to apply or not. Maybe getting on a preliminary call with someone will really help you understand whether you are at that stage in your life wherein an MBA application makes sense. Because in fact, a fun fact is that most of the applications for a deferred MBA are identical to the full-time MBA applicants. So it's no, of course, the content will differ because you've probably just lived your college experience so far. But the fact that the applications are almost identical really shows us that it's not really a lower bar that you're being graded on, or it's not even a very different bar, in fact. You're being graded in a very similar way. So with that in mind, you really have to do a lot of self-analysis as to whether you're ready. And if you are ready, of course, then put everything you've got into it and never, ever dream small. Because unless you dream big, you'll never be able to achieve big. So the dream is really the upper limit. So ensure that the upper limit is the true upper limit. I think at the end of this entire journey, there were two surprises for me. One is that they're just so genuinely interested in you. A lot of these schools, especially Kellogg, which is something that really also attracted me towards Kellogg and Kellogg's style, really, in terms of how genuinely they wanted to understand who you are as a person and where you're coming from. And that's something which is also great to understand in terms of an international applicant, because of course you're going to a place where you've never been before. So that's something which is a great feeling. And second, of course, the surprise being that I actually got in. It still feels surreal, unreal, all of those words. Is it just, it's just the sense of question, is it really me who was secured an admit to such a prestigious, one of the world's most prestigious institutions in Northwestern Kellogg? Also, one small bit would also be that, of course, a consultant is an expense. I think there's absolutely no doubt about that. It's an expense that you should definitely be keeping in your mental math. So if you have to account for it, if you have to save for it, if you have to ensure that you're making your funds available for it, as was the case with me, it's something you should definitely do well in advance, so that you're not left without a lot of means. But at the same time, I would still recommend taking up a consultant. I'm not even necessarily limiting myself to Sumit here, although I can only speak for him because I work with him. But the processes have a lot of nuance, and there are a lot of specific preferences which colleges have, which you almost can never figure out just by yourself. You need someone who's seen a lot of applications, so they know what really works, what doesn't work. And they also know where the schools are headed, because that's very dynamic in terms of what the school's priorities are. And that's information that is probably not just going to be available to you on a Google search. And the kind of dedicated experience that consultants have with specific schools, that's going to be extremely helpful. So ultimately, just to end, I think at this stage, there's honestly nothing but gratitude for me. I'm extremely happy to pass it on to help anyone. If you need any sort of guidance, at least in my limited capacity, I'm always welcome. I'm always there for you on LinkedIn. So you're always welcome to just drop in a message. And I can also confidently, as I've said multiple times, endorse Sumit Yerlikar and Tilden, who really left no stone unturned to ensure that I get the kind of results that I was hopeful for and working towards. So all the best.